Greetings, friends of liberty. When my colleagues look across the channel and see those Frenchies, with their insufferable notions of their own superiority, and having 28 million souls, from Marseille to Calais, as opposed to the 8 million of our own blessed England, I can understand their apprehensions. They're fully aware, God forbid, that if a nationalist as opposed to patriotic leader would emerge from this revolutionary turmoil and succeed in seizing the reins of power, those excitable garlic eaters might form an enormous army and attempt to expand their power across the continent. Of course, I don't have the heart to tell my colleagues of my future knowledge and of the rise of that miserable little Corsican corporal. However, if we turn to your 21st century, we find an actual defender of nationalism in Yoram Hazony, director of the Herzl Institute, an Israeli think tank specializing in understanding nationalism, Judaism, anti-Semitism, and Zionism. Hazony is an author both of the philosophy of Hebrew Scripture and in 2016 God and Politics in Esther, and here has written The Virtue of Nationalism. In contrast to Rich Lowry's The Case for Nationalism, which I reviewed 3 months ago, which consisted mainly in throwing huge numbers of historical examples at the reader, Hazony instead has constructed a comprehensive and intricate argument using familial, tribal, political, and historical evidence. He starts by claiming that until recently, nationalism was looked upon by many prominent statesmen, such as Teddy Roosevelt, Dwight Eisenhower, Ronald Reagan, and Margaret Thatcher, as a good thing. However, by my definition of nationalism, which is the belief that you can further the interests of a nation by violating property rights, either of the people within or those outside your borders, only Teddy Roosevelt was a real nationalist. He believed in making national parks federal, thereby turning them into huge fire hazards of wasted wood, having damaged railroads and banks with his antitrust regulations, and damaging free trade with his support for protectionism. Ronald Reagan, to the contrary, specifically talked of informed patriotism. Patriotism being, again by my definition, the belief that you cannot further the interests of a nation by violating property rights. And Margaret Thatcher believed in classical liberalism, which Hazony, as we shall see, hates. So in this initial statement by him trying to enlist these famous four leaders to his nationalist cause, only Teddy Roosevelt really qualifies. Yoram proceeds by giving his own definition of nationalism. The standpoint that regards the world as governed best when nations are able to chart their own independent course, cultivating their own traditions, and pursuing their own interests without interference. The problems with this definition are two. First, he pretends that national traditions like the Polish polka, or the Scots inventing golf, or American baseball, which constitute a nation's psychological and historical identity, are somehow connected with political nationalism. They are not, any more than the fact that one person loves playing ping pong says anything about whether he's a Democrat or Republican. Secondly, when he says that nationalistic countries should pursue their interests without interference, presumably he means that they still need to respect the property rights of people in other countries when they do so. Otherwise, those countries would be interfering with them pursuing their own interests. He never clarifies this ambiguity. Yoram claims that imperialism and nationalism are opposed ideals, and that nationalism is different from imperialism, which seeks to bring peace and prosperity to the world by uniting mankind under a single political regime. But here again, he gets his history wrong, as many nationalist countries, such as modern-day China and Russia, and historically Germany, Italy, Japan, and Spain during the 30s and 40s were quintessentially nationalist, while also being obviously imperialist. As nationalists, all these countries believed in invading other countries to get their land and resources for their own country. Pure nationalism. Think China and Tibet, Russia and Eastern Europe after World War II, Russia and the Ukraine today, Germany in World War I and II, France in the Napoleonic Wars, and Japan before and during World War II. All very nationalist, all very imperialist. He continues in this vein by saying, the most famous examples of the hatred generated by imperialist or universalist ideologies is perhaps Christian anti-Semitism. The problem with this statement is that the religions that were most obviously anti-Semitic were also those like Catholicism and Islam, which closely allied themselves with state power and used that state power to kill Jews. But relatively peaceful universalist religions like Buddhism in countries like Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam, and Christian Protestant or atheist countries that represent universal Enlightenment values and that have a strict separation of church and state, like England, America, Denmark, and Sweden, are known to be very tolerant to Jews. So his point that universalism, either of religion or of Enlightenment values, must breed anti-Semitism is simply false. Some universal belief systems are good, others bad. Given that Hazony constantly touts collective rights, like the right of a nation or tribe to determine its own political destiny, and almost never discusses the value of individual rights, it's not surprising that he now proceeds to attack the greatest defender of individual rights and freedom in the history of the West, John Locke, falsely calling Locke a liberal when by today's standards he's really a libertarian or classical liberal. What Hazony wants to do with his tactic is make it seem as if there are only two political choices, conservative and modern liberal. But there are actually three, conservative, libertarian, and liberal. He begins his attack on Locke by focusing on one of the few theoretical mistakes Locke made, Locke's belief that good states originate by getting the consent of all the governed. Now, it's true when tribes or chiefdoms or states form, they generally didn't get everyone's consent. So Locke was wrong there. But that still ignores, as Locke recognized, that consent is enormously important, as we all know today, since most politicians constantly check their approval ratings to see how much people consent to their actions. In addition, through the last 500 years in the West, gaining the consent of the people through parliaments and legislatures and democracy has been of increasing and now overwhelming importance. In order to further attack Locke, Hazony here introduces his own theory of group cohesion, which he calls mutual loyalty, using it throughout the book. He says, for example, that in a family, brothers and sisters born to the same parents have a special responsibility to help one another in a time of need that takes precedence over other obligations. But that none of these family relationships are the result of consent. One does not choose one's brothers or one's grandchildren. And so these obligations must derive from other sources. And this, he says, is mutual loyalty. The problem with creating this alleged intrinsic obligation is that, for example, both a mother and son have individual rights, which need to be respected if they are to be happy. So if a mother deliberately and repeatedly burns her son with boiling water, she deserves no loyalty. Similarly, if a son repeatedly punches his mother, knocking her out, he also deserves no loyalty. Mutual loyalty, then, as a pretense for automatically binding people together is a farce, because loyalty is conditional on one person respecting the property rights and happiness of the other. In this, as in all human relationships. What really binds human beings together, then, is not loyalty, but love, which, as we all know, is not automatic. Pretending now that he's found some universal social glue, automatic mutual loyalty, that forces everyone to support their own families, he then shifts to claiming that this same universal glue obligates people to support their clans, then their tribes, and then their nation-states. And so when he concludes that a Lockean theory of the state does not enable us to understand, much less justify, the existence of the national state, this is utterly false, since Locke would have told us that nations or people form states precisely for the incredibly important reason of protecting their property rights. That's what patriotism is, the desire to form together with other citizens to create a country to protect property rights. And it's exactly what your founding fathers who loved John Locke did, creating the greatest country in world history. Of course, later in the book, Hazony simply denies that this kind of a country, representing what he calls civic nationalism, can exist, saying that the neutral state is a myth. He then, as a good nationalist who believes in violating rights, starts listing all the evil results of human freedom. Free trade, which is simply people trading with each other and is partly responsible for the enormous wealth of the modern world. Free immigration, which, if you don't have a welfare state in your country and don't have public education and lots of other freebies, is a good thing. And multinational corporations, as if John Deere selling tractors to both the Americans and the French is evil. And given that he constantly confuses classical liberals or libertarians with leftists, in other words, confusing old-fashioned liberalism with modern liberalism, he constantly assumes that classical liberals believe in many things only modern liberals accept. The EU, international law courts, which can violate the property rights of individual countries, and the rise of progressive international NGOs, which often cause harm to the people they're trying to help. He next quite heroically tries to explain away the exceedingly problematic fact of a certain fascist political regime in 1930s Germany called National Socialism. The Nazis. Weren't they nationalist? Wasn't their self-identification correct? No, he says. Hitler was no advocate of nationalism. How does he justify this? By saying, in place of the order of national states, Hitler set out to establish a Third Reich. So clearly he's referring to the third part of his initial definition of nationalism, when he said that all countries should be able to pursue their own interests without interference. So then presumably by this definition, Hitler was interfering with other countries, which didn't make him a nationalist. But again, the problem with this is that we can't know what interference is unless we have a concept of property rights. How can we adjudicate any disputes between nations otherwise? And then Hazony slips us a further deception. He says, the Nazi extermination of the Jews in Poland, Russia, and the rest of Europe and North Africa was not a national policy, but a global one. No, it was the national policy of one specific country, not a global one of many different countries. But to the extent that it was one country trying to kill Jews, it was completely nationalist, just like China today killing Uyghurs or Russians, Ukrainians, in exact accordance with my definition, trying to pursue your national interest by violating property rights, in this case by killing other human beings. Having attacked John Locke, the intellectual father of your Constitution and Declaration of Independence, which helped make your country extraordinarily successful, he then quotes the famous classical liberal and champion of free market economics, Ludwig von Mises, who said, "The greatest ideological question that mankind has ever faced is whether we shall succeed in creating throughout the world a frame of mind of nothing less than the unqualified, unconditional acceptance of liberalism, if the prerequisites of peace are to be created and the causes of war eliminated." Now, by this statement, von Mises again meant classical liberalism, whose chief political end is respecting the property rights of others. Respecting property rights is exactly what having a productive and peaceful world is all about. Hazony, however, being a nationalist, can never explicitly say this, even though, as we saw, he smuggled it into his definition of nationalism by implying that all nations should not interfere with other nations. His constant explicit hostility towards the notion of property rights is also expressed when he says that many political theories assume that political events are motivated by the individual's concern for his own life and property. Yet anyone who has witnessed the behavior of individuals in wartime or under conditions of nonviolent conflict understands that this assumption is widely inaccurate. The problem again here is that human beings understand when they're forming a patriotic nation that they all need to protect their property rights together. It's a group effort. And when everyone fights to protect their property, as in wartime, everyone benefits. Which means it's both selfish and social, as long as everyone follows that rule. Interestingly, being an Orthodox Jew, he claims that the best nationalism is biblical. But is it? The Jews of the Bible left Egypt, invaded the land of Canaan, murdering and driving out many of its inhabitants. He never addresses how these murdering tribal war bands are really any different from the violent fascist and nationalistic regimes of the 1930s. Another interesting question is whether, for a Jewish person who wants to be happy, that person would be better off moving to Israel or the U.S. Einstein himself was a perfect example of how one Jew moving to the U.S. and helping to develop the atomic bomb helped both Jews and everyone else much more than if he had moved to what was then Palestine. And while I'm perfectly happy that Israel exists, I suspect that for most Jews, as many people, the answer is that the best course of action for any given Jew would be to move to the U.S., not Israel. Now, Hazony appears to disagree, saying, with regard to Jews in America during World War II, that they did not have national freedom, and so they were not free. National freedom came only with the establishment of a Jewish national state in Israel. That's an astonishing and insulting statement. An example of Hazony's immoral collectivism at work. According to him, an American Jew is obligated to love Jews around the world more than other Americans or the people of other countries. That is an example of the ethnocentric prejudice inherent in nationalism. He also displays his ethnocentrism when he claims that more diversity makes the state more difficult to govern. But the reality is that the United States, one of the most diverse countries in history, has been enormously successful, even though attracting Irish, Germans, Poles, Italians, Portuguese, Mexicans, Chinese, Vietnamese, Indians, and Thais. Because in America, what draws people together and creates a great nation more than any other country is a love of freedom, found in the soul of every human being, irrespective of the nationality of his forefathers. Partly because Israel only attracts Jews, it's tiny. But because the U.S. attracts everyone, it's a huge country with 330 million people, meaning it can both protect itself and help protect its allies better. This is a fundamental problem for any ethnocentric state. And also why, incidentally, being nationalist is unpatriotic. Hazony also criticizes the U.S. for not bombing the Auschwitz crematoria or rail lines leading there during World War II, without realizing that low-level bombing raids were highly dangerous to air crews, and high-level raids were ineffective and would have killed many innocent Jews as well as still being dangerous. Although I think I've covered the majority of his crucial points, there's still much left to discuss. I'd give this book a C- because even though it utterly fails in defending nationalism and is boringly written, it's very comprehensive, making many, many different arguments and sub-arguments, and rhetorically it's very accomplished in putting gobs of cosmetics on the pig of nationalism. Seeing how he uses so much Maybelline eyeliner, Clinique blusher, and Christian Dior $9.99 lipstick to dress up his failing arguments makes this book an excellent tutorial for noticing such techniques in other writers. On that note of cosmetic admiration, I bid you well and remain the Scarlet Pimpernel.